They always question why was confiscation of property important for the security of the country. You know, we know the answer is they were trying to get rid of the Japanese from the West Coast.
1988年9月22日、カナダの日経史に刻まれる衝撃的な出来事が起きました。1950年にカナダ政府に指名されたヘンリー・バード判事により、一部の日系カナダ人が申し立てた不動産損失をめぐる補償請求が受理されたものの、過ちに対する謝罪並び、権利の剥奪、これに漏れた多くの人々に対する補償が盛り込まれないものであったことで、以降、1970年後半から80年にかけ、NAJC が政府に対し行っていた日系カナダ人全体に対する補償問題が、この日ようやく解決しました。
100th year since the first immigrant came from Japan. That was Mr. Manzo Nagano came from Japan in 1877. So with that 1977 what we call the centennial year, there are many events right across Canada that the Japanese Canadians put on, and it was put on with lots of encouragement from the federal, provincial, and local governments to have this kind of event. It was respecting the multicultural nature. I think it was also respecting what the Japanese Canadians went through during the war. So at the end of the 1977 centennial year, there was a JCCA conference, Canadian conference, held in Winnipeg. And we had gone through many events and in 1977, and I think we came to realize that the Japanese Canadians have a part in our country, or we played a part in our country. Be it was a blemish, it was a black mark. We were treated as enemy people and so forth. So what happened at that conference was some voices started to say, there should be acknowledgement. There should be acknowledgement of the wrongdoing on the part of the government. There should be an apology, and there should be compensation. So that's when the redress movement kind of got started. And at that time, of course, the Japanese Canadians were scattered right across the nation, and we did not have a well-unified national group. So I, with some others, worked to try to bring all the Japanese Canadians together to think that and to prepare ourselves to have one representative organization in Canada. And so in 1979, we formed what is now the NAJC, and that was formed in Vancouver. And that year was the last year of the National JCCA. So we formed the NAJC, and that was going to be our shall we say, starting block or starting group to pursue redress and to make ourselves aware of our presence and of our activities and our part in Canada. In 1984, we had a national conference in Winnipeg again. And that 1984 conference, I was the president of the NAJC until that time, and then Art Miki became the president. And that 1984 conference in Winnipeg was the start of the real redress movement.
There was one person you might have wanted to talk to in Ottawa is Ansu Nahara. She had written a book called Politics of Racism, and it's a really good resource book because that's the book that we use in justifying redress. because she went through the government files, found documents that indicated that the government reacted to the British Columbia politicians rather than looking at the thing in terms of security, and that both the RCMP and the Army both recommended to Cabinet that it was not necessary to remove Japanese from the West Coast. And yet they went ahead and did it because I think it was for political reasons.
Gabriel Nishiguchi had aired this as a documentary, and she had discovered that the Prime Minister had commissioned these two people to come up with a plan of how to rid one Asian factor out of Canada. And they came up and said, gather them all up, know where they are, collect all their assets, sell it out from under them, and so that there's no way that they could come back to something that they owned, and then deport them. And according to the Geneva Convention, you can't, because people were born here, 60% of those that they were trying to deport were Canadian citizens, Canadians. Well, they didn't have a Canadian Citizenship Act at that time, but they were going to deport all these people, and they said, they're not deporting them, you're exiling them, and you cannot exile your citizens.
And so we began to uncover documents such as that. And as a result, people were then pretty convinced that maybe it shouldn't have happened. And so we began, the National Association began a redress movement. At the same time, in 1980, the American, in the United States, if you know the history of Japanese Americans, they suffered a similar fate. They were removed from the West Coast, put into concentration camps. And so, in essence, they were getting publicity because in the United States, they had a congressional committee that went across the country looking at it, what happened to Japanese Americans. And eventually, the committee recommended that there should be compensation for Japanese Americans for the way they were treated. In Canada, we knew about this. However, our situation was a little different, and in fact, Japanese Canadians were even treated more severely than Americans. We approached, at that time, Trudeau was the Prime Minister, and basically he rejected anything of trying to redress Japanese Canadians. He basically said it's in the past. We can't really be, apologizing for things that happened a long time ago. However, at the same time, Brian Mulroney, as an opposition person, says, well, if it were the Conservative government, we would surely compensate Japanese Canadians. And then shortly after that, he got elected. And so we held him to that word, and he did set up meetings with us and the minister. However, and that was in 1984, the fall of '84. We had these meetings, but then we began to realize that they weren't really wanting to negotiate. They wanted to just impose some type of arrangement that we would endorse, and we wouldn't accept it.
They told me to shut up, and
We used to get phone calls.
creating a wave.
One of the difficult times of trying to get this thing going was the fact that we had splinter groups in our community, groups that were opposing what we're doing, etc. So the government was able to use that, play one group against another. We'll say, well, we met with this group, they don't support you, you don't even represent the Japanese Canadians. That went on and on like that.
Because I was on the strategy committee, there'd be people from across Canada giving me phoning me. What are you doing that for?
By time 1986-87 came around, the government finally determined that we were the true representatives. Meanwhile, in the United States, we knew that there was some talk that there'd be a redress bill eventually. Our government, even David Crombie says, no, they're not going to do it. We talk to Americans all the time, they're politicians, and they tell us that it's not going to happen. So either you accept what we offer or that's it. And so then we decided that we have to use a different approach, because up to this point we were just meeting with the government, our community with the government, and we had all these meetings with the opposition and so on. We decided that we would take a different approach, that we would try to make this more of a Canadian human rights issue, and we invited other Canadians to come and support us. And so we formed what we call a National Coalition for Japanese Canadian Redress. In the end, we had a whole list of Canadians who supported politicians, writers, musicians, university profs, mayors of cities. We had this whole list of people. We got all the unions, major unions at that time, CUPE, the auto workers, and all those people sent letters of support. And then the national churches also. We approached the United Church, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, and we got support. So it became more of a Canadian issue. And in 1988, in April, we had a big rally in Ottawa. And this is the culmination of this coalition that we established. And we had representatives from many different groups come and speak in the West Block on Parliament Hill. And they spoke in support of having a negotiated agreement or some type of arrangement that would satisfy our community. And so I thought that that was likely the turning point for us, because at that point we had about 400 Japanese Canadians, and these are mostly elderly people who came by bus and so on, and they marched on Parliament Hill. And we were criticized by some community members for doing that, because they said that's not the Japanese way. But we had to explain, we're talking the Canadian way now. You know, we're not in Japan, we're in Canada, and marches on the hill is something that happens to get your point across. It was in August 6th, Reagan signed the bill for the Japanese American bill. So right away I sent a letter to our Prime Minister saying, you know, if he can do it, why can't you, you know, that type of thing. And shortly after that we got contact from his office. In fact, even before that we got contact that they wanted to sit down again and talk about what could work out. And their biggest fear at the time that we met was saving face, because they've already gone public to saying that's the end of the road. How do you bring this issue back up in the public, you know? In the United States, I mean, as I mentioned before, when Pearl Harbor, they were moved from the West Coast. First of all, they didn't confiscate property. Some people sold their property because they assumed that they would not come back. But they could not confiscate property that was against the Constitution. Secondly, once they were placed into the concentration camps, people were asked to sign a loyalty oath, saying, I am loyal to the United States. A lot of Nisei, second generation people, refused to sign it, saying, why should I have to indicate my loyalty when I was born here? And it was on that principle that many of them refused to sign it. If you signed the loyalty oath, you were able to go back to the West Coast. And that occurred within 6 months of after being removed. In Canada, you could not go back to the West Coast until 1949, 4 years after the war ended, because we had legislation that prevented that movement. And so that was a significant difference. So there's this idea of the property, and also the fact that we were restricted for a lot longer. And then in Canada, there are some 4,000 people who were sent to Japan by the government. In the United States, that never happened. Some volunteered to go, but they were not forced to go. And so those are the differences. In the United States, many of them, to show their loyalty, did join the Army. In Canada, you couldn't join the Army. They refused you. Even if you applied, they wouldn't take you. And the reason they didn't want to take Japanese is because back in 1931, the Japanese Canadians who fought in World War I were granted the right to vote. And at that time, no Japanese had the right to vote. And because you served in the Army, they had to give them the right to vote. And they said, if you let them join the Second World War in the Army, we have to give them the right to vote, because we didn't have the vote then. And so that was a refusal on that basis of giving the franchise. One of the things that the government used to come back to us as we're negotiating is, what did you really lose? You know, you tell us that the people lost this and that, but what did you lose in terms of monetary? And we couldn't answer that question. We had no idea. So we were going to hire an accounting company to do the research. So we asked for a grant from the government. Wow, the minister said, ha ha ha. Why would we give you money to use against us, for a study to use against? I said, what you do with Aboriginal peoples. They said, oh, that's different. But anyway, they refused. And fortunately, and this is an interesting story, because fortunately, we had some people who knew Pricewaterhouse people. The president set up a meeting with the president. And it was going to cost us $150,000 to do this study. We tried fundraising within our community. We raised about $25,000, $30,000, but you know, I mean, for a small community, it's quite a bit. And especially when some people didn't think it would ever happen, you know, so you didn't have that support base. But when the president of Pricewaterhouse met with us, he was quite moved. And he relayed the story about his father, who was president of Pricewaterhouse during the war. And he said his father knew some Japanese Canadians who were sent to internment camps. And one of the things he said is, you know, his father felt they should have done something, but never. Yeah. And so the son decided that he would do it for his father. Well, I mean, I think people were more shocked and surprised, although they knew that this whole process is going on. And I can recall talking to our community people and some people saying, you know, our community is so small, the government will just ignore you. You know, you're not a political force, you're not a voting force. Why would they even listen? But in a lot of ways, I think the lesson that was learned is that the coalition of other people and having that support is a powerful force. Yes. And so you can make a difference from that perspective. People were quite surprised, but happy. First generation people, a lot of them were saying, first of all, you know, we went through a lot of racism. You're going to just create backlash on us. Once you start asking for money with government, what is my neighbor going to think of me, you know, being part of that? And there was that fear of backlash, and that was a very strong fear. With, I would say, the first generation people, a lot of them were just happy that they were here. And so why would you, you know, go against the country? But when you're a second generation, they say if you're born here, you begin to question those principles. And one of the things I heard quite often is that no one's going to listen to you. So why would you spend your effort on it? And we've had people, even in the group that were, you know, working together, some of them dropped out because they felt that it would never happen. You know, that frustration.
This did bring about a greater support to the Canadian-Japanese organizations across Canada. We did receive a lot of respect from outside of our community. Okay, which is satisfaction. But as time goes by, these fade. And that is my fear, that unless we keep telling people of our experience and what we achieved, right, that things could happen again. And one of the things that really disturbed me was when the September the 11th, a lot of the Middle East people were incarcerated, just as you were. They enacted the War Measures Act to put, they didn't call it the War Measures Act, they called it the Terrorists Act, I think it was. Right. And it could happen all over again. You know, it could fall apart so quickly. And the people that are in power forget about what the rights are. And I hope that we will be able to keep the injustices down to very, limited, so that things that happen to us will never happen again.
One of the eldest gentlemen that I knew, 90 years old up here, Calgary, said, Roy, he said, in my lifetime I would like the government to give an apology. It's all I want to hear, that they made the mistake. He said, I'm not interested in money, but I would like, while I'm still alive, to get an apology from the government. And he did receive a compensation. But to a lot of the older people, like my parents, were already gone, so they didn't benefit. So it actually came about maybe 20 years too late.
When you cost out the project, it ran to 81 million. So you have senior centers that we put a little bit, but with other support they got, and so.
We did not fund anybody 100% of what they asked for. Okay. And that was so that they would have to have community involvement. And so the redress movement did tie together the community in remembrance of those that had passed away.